Most people who came of age after the Vietnam War were told it was a war that America misunderstood, that the public turned against something they never fully grasped, that the soldiers came home to a country that had not done the work to understand what those men had been through. That version of events is easier to carry. It distributes the weight more evenly. It makes misunderstanding the cause and incomprehension the failure. But there is another reading, one that the official record spent a great deal of energy preventing from taking hold, and it is this: the war was not misunderstood. It was misrepresented, deliberately, systematically, and at every level of command. From the platoon leader who falsified a contact report to the general who briefed the Secretary of Defense with numbers that no one who had been in the field would have recognized. The gap between what happened in Vietnam and what was reported as happening in Vietnam was not a gap born of confusion. It was a gap that had been engineered. The war produced a particular kind of institutional dishonesty, one that was not driven by individual cowardice so much as by the logic of a bureaucracy that had decided, very early, that success needed to be demonstrated rather than achieved. When you make that decision, everything else follows. You begin measuring things that can be counted, because counting creates the appearance of progress. You report the counts upward, and the counts become policy. The policy produces more counting. The men in the field understand that the counts are wrong because they are the ones generating the wrong counts. But the men in the field also understand that the wrong counts are what is wanted, and that providing correct counts will not change the war. It will only change their careers. So the wrong counts flow upward, and the briefings in Saigon describe a war that bears almost no relationship to the war being fought 200 kilometers away in the paddies and the highlands and the rubber plantations. By 1966, American commanders were using a metric called body count as the primary indicator of progress. The logic was straightforward enough on paper. If the enemy loses more men than it can replace, the enemy eventually loses the capacity to fight. Body count was the measure of attrition, but almost immediately the metric began to degrade, not because the concept was wrong, but because the incentive structure around it was catastrophically misaligned. Units that reported high body counts received praise. Units that reported low body counts were questioned. Officers whose careers depended on demonstrating results had every reason to report high and no institutional reason to report accurately. What followed was predictable. Body counts were inflated. Sometimes they were doubled, sometimes they were fabricated entirely. Dead civilians were counted as enemy combatants. Water buffalo were occasionally included. Soldiers have described standing over a body and being told by their sergeant to count it twice because the sergeant needed the number. The official records of enemy killed in action during the Vietnam War are, by the assessment of most serious military historians, essentially fictional. They represent not what happened, but what the system needed to have happened. This was not a secret inside the military. The people generating the false numbers knew they were false. The officers receiving the false numbers had often generated false numbers themselves at earlier stages of their careers and knew exactly what they were receiving. The analysts at MACV, the Military Assistance Command Vietnam in Saigon, had access to enough conflicting data to understand that the field reports were systematically unreliable. And yet the false numbers continued to flow upward, and they continued to be briefed to Washington, and Washington continued to make decisions based on them. General William Westmoreland told the National Press Club in November of 1967 that the enemy was losing, that the crossover point had been reached, that the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were taking casualties faster than they could be replaced. 2 months later, during the Tet Offensive, approximately 85,000 enemy fighters launched simultaneous coordinated attacks on more than 100 South Vietnamese cities and towns. The crossover point had not been reached. The enemy had not run out of men. The numbers had simply been telling a story that the war itself was not telling. The Tet Offensive is usually discussed in terms of its impact on American public opinion, and that impact was real. But what tends to receive less attention is what Tet revealed about the intelligence architecture that had been generating those optimistic assessments. Months before Tet, American analysts had intercepted communications that suggested a massive coordinated offensive was being planned. The signals were there. The evidence existed. It was interpreted in ways that minimized it, or it was filtered out before it reached decision-makers, or it was received by decision-makers who had already committed themselves publicly to the narrative of progress and could not incorporate information that contradicted it. The failure was not primarily a failure of intelligence collection. It was a failure of institutional willingness to hear what the intelligence was saying. After Tet, the United States continued fighting for more than 5 additional years. There is a photograph that was taken somewhere in Qinghai province in early 1968. It shows a group of American soldiers sitting beside a trail. They are not posing. They are simply sitting, the way men sit when they have been moving for a long time and have stopped, because there is nothing else to do at that moment. Their faces are not frightened or angry or heroic. They are blank in a way that has nothing to do with calm. Men who have been in the field long enough develop a particular kind of blankness, not the blankness of stupidity or shock, but the blankness of someone who has decided, at some level below conscious thought, not to process what is happening in real time, because processing it in real time would make it impossible to continue. The photograph was not published. Most of what was real about Vietnam was not published, not because there was an official censorship apparatus suppressing it, but because the institutions that disseminated information had their own reasons to prefer the available narrative, and the available narrative required a certain kind of image and a certain kind of story, and the photograph of men sitting blankly by a trail did not fit. In the Delta provinces in 1967 and 1968, American and South Vietnamese forces conducted a program called Operation Speedy Express. The stated purpose was to destroy enemy forces in Quien Hoa province. The operation ran for approximately 6 months. The official body count at the end of the operation was somewhere above 10,000 enemy killed. The number of weapons captured was around 700. In counterinsurgency doctrine, the ratio of weapons captured to enemy killed is one of the indicators used to assess whether the enemy fighters being counted are actually fighters. A ratio of 1 weapon for every 14 or 15 enemy dead is not consistent with an army of combatants. Soldiers who were in Quien Hoa during Speedy Express have described in subsequent years what the operations actually involved. They have described killing that was not discriminate, that did not distinguish reliably between combatants and the civilian population, that was driven by the pressure to produce body counts that would justify the continuation of the operation and the careers of the men overseeing it. Newsweek published a partial account of Speedy Express in 1972. The Pentagon did not confirm the account. The operations commander received a Distinguished Service Medal. The Phoenix program began as a systematic effort to identify and neutralize the Viet Cong political infrastructure. Neutralize was the official term. It meant capture, defection, or death in roughly that order of preference according to the program's stated guidelines. What the program became in practice varied enormously depending on the province, the personnel, the degree of South Vietnamese involvement, and the degree of pressure being applied from above to produce numbers. At its best, Phoenix was an intelligence-driven operation that successfully disrupted enemy networks and brought genuine combatants out of the field. At its worst, it was a system in which provincial authorities used American resources and American cover to settle local scores, eliminate political opponents, and produce body counts that satisfied the reporting requirements without doing anything to actually degrade enemy capability. The program's official neutralization statistics, which ran into the tens of thousands, included an unknown but significant number of people who were not Viet Cong, who had been denounced by neighbors or rivals, or who had been killed because killing was faster than the processing paperwork. Congressional testimony in 1971 by William Colby, who oversaw Phoenix at one stage, acknowledged that abuses had occurred. The program continued until 1972. There is a particular quality to the testimonies that veterans gave in the years after they came home. The ones who gave testimony, which was not most of them, The men who spoke at the Winter Soldier investigation in Detroit in 1971 described things that the American public was not prepared to believe. Not entirely. Not in the way that would have required a fundamental reconsideration of what the war was. They described free fire zones, where the designation of an area as a free fire zone meant that anyone in the area could be treated as an enemy. They described rules of engagement that existed on paper and did not exist in practice. They described the killing of prisoners, not as isolated incidents committed by individuals who had broken under pressure, but as something that happened with regularity, that was sometimes ordered, that was sometimes the result of simple logistical necessity, because you could not move prisoners through the jungle, and you could not leave them alive to warn others, and so you killed them, and you put something else in the report. The men who gave this testimony were not lying. The things they described were not exceptional. What was exceptional was that they were saying them out loud. The fragging problem became statistically significant around 1969. Fragging was the term used for the killing of officers and non-commissioned officers by their own men, named for the fragmentation grenades that were a common method. The Army tracked these incidents because it had to, because men were dying in ways that were difficult to attribute to combat. But the full scale of the problem was not publicly disclosed during the war. The confirmed fragging incidents numbered in the hundreds. The suspected incidents numbered considerably higher. The men who committed these acts were not, in most cases, men who had broken entirely. They were men who had made a calculation, sometimes collectively, that a particular officer was going to get them killed through incompetence or recklessness, or a desire to produce the kind of contact that would look good in his record, and that the calculation of survival required removing that officer from the equation. The Army's response was to handle most of these cases quietly, to assign deaths to hostile fire when the evidence permitted, and to address the underlying problem with a series of morale initiatives that did not address the underlying problem. In 1969, a survey conducted by the Army found that a significant proportion of soldiers in Vietnam believed the war was not worth fighting. The survey was classified. The information was used internally to track trends in morale. It was not released publicly. By 1971, the Army was dealing with what it internally described as a collapse of unit cohesion in certain elements of the force. Drug use had become widespread enough that it was affecting operational capability. The heroin available in Vietnam was of a purity that was not available in the United States, and it was cheap, and it was everywhere. And men who might not have become addicted to weaker versions of the drug became addicted in Vietnam and brought that addiction home with them. The Army's response included the development of urine testing programs and amnesty policies for soldiers who voluntarily sought treatment. The scale of the drug problem in Vietnam was acknowledged in military documents that were not made available to the public until years after the war ended. The village of My Lai is the incident that has become the placeholder for the broader reality of what happened in Vietnam, and this is both appropriate and misleading. It is appropriate because what happened there on March 16, 1968 was real and documented, and eventually, after more than a year of suppression, brought to public attention through the work of journalist Seymour Hersh. It is misleading because My Lai has functioned as a kind of container for a horror that was much larger than any single incident. By treating My Lai as the exception, as the thing that should not have happened and did not represent the war as a whole, the official account has preserved a version of the war that is livable. The men who were there have described a different version. Veterans who served in other provinces during the same period have described operations that were not reported, incidents that were filed as contacts with enemy forces, actions against civilian populations that were never investigated because no one who had the power to investigate them had any interest in doing so. My Lai was not reported by the men who participated in it or by the officers who knew about it. It was suppressed for 14 months. The only reason it eventually became public is that a soldier named Ron Riddenhauer wrote letters to Congress describing what he had been told by men who were there. If Riddenhauer had not written those letters, My Lai would be a footnote in an after-action report, indistinguishable from the other footnotes. The men who flew the B-52 missions over Cambodia from 1969 to 1970 were operating under orders that did not officially exist. The bombing of Cambodia, which President Nixon authorized in the first weeks of his presidency, was conducted under a system of falsified records designed to conceal the operations from Congress and from the public. Pilots filed one set of reports indicating their targets were in South Vietnam. A second set of classified records accurately reflected that the targets were in Cambodia. The operational name was Menu, and its components were named breakfast, lunch, snack, dinner, dessert, and supper, which has the quality of bureaucratic black humor that surfaces in war planning when the planners have been doing it long enough. The bombing killed an unknown number of Cambodian civilians. The estimates range widely. The official position was that only enemy base areas were being targeted and that civilian casualties were minimal. The actual pattern of bombing, which became available through declassified records years later, does not fully support this position. The bombing of Cambodia was not publicly acknowledged until 1970, when it was revealed not by the government, but by reporting in the New York Times, which had been alerted by a source within the national security apparatus. When the Army commissioned what became known as the Peers Commission to investigate the My Lai massacre and its suppression, the investigation produced a report that was damaging in ways that went beyond the specific incident. The Peers report documented not just what had happened in the village, but how the system of reporting had functioned to ensure that what had happened would not be known. It documented the lies that had been told at each level of the chain of command, the false reports that had been filed, the investigations that had been conducted in bad faith, the witnesses who had been discouraged from speaking. The report was a map of institutional dishonesty. Charges were eventually filed against 14 officers. One was convicted. Lieutenant William Calley, who had led the platoon that carried out the killings, was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. President Nixon ordered him released to house arrest pending appeal 3 days after the conviction. He served approximately 3.5 years under house arrest and was then paroled. The officers above him who had ordered, permitted, or concealed the massacre were not convicted. The Strategic Hamlet Program, which preceded the major American military build-up and which was the primary counterinsurgency strategy of the early 1960s, failed in ways that were clear to people in the field and were not reported accurately to Washington. The program was designed to separate the rural population from the Viet Cong by relocating villages into fortified compounds. It failed for reasons that should have been predictable, because it was forcing people to leave land that their families had farmed for generations. Land where their ancestors were buried, land that was the foundation of their economic and social existence, and placing them in what were essentially prison camps surrounded by barbed wire and defended by men they had no particular reason to trust. The program created resentment where it needed to create loyalty. The strategic hamlets were often infiltrated immediately because the Viet Cong were already inside them, were the brothers and cousins and husbands of the people being relocated. The program statistics reported to Washington showed steady progress. By the time the program collapsed in the wake of the 1963 coup that removed Ngo Dinh Diem, thousands of hamlets had been reported as completed and pacified that were not completed and had never been pacified. The reporters who covered Vietnam in its early years, before the war became the defining news story of the decade, faced a particular kind of institutional pressure. They were not censored in the formal sense. There was no official review of their copy before it was filed. But there were briefings, the daily briefings in Saigon that became known as the 5 o'clock follies, which presented a version of the war's progress that reporters who had been in the field recognized as false. And the question was what to do with that recognition. The reporters who wrote what they had seen, who reported from the field and described a war that was not going well, who quoted the officers in the field who privately said that the official line was wrong. Those reporters were excluded from access, were challenged publicly by the embassy and by MACV, were subjected to pressure through their editors and publishers, were accused of being unpatriotic, of undermining the war effort, of helping the enemy. David Halberstam and Neil Sheehan and Peter Arnett and Malcolm Brown reported accurately from Vietnam in the early 1960s and were told by senior officials that they were wrong, that they were seeing it wrong, that they were being manipulated by sources with agendas. President Kennedy personally asked the New York Times to reassign Halberstam. The Times did not reassign him. What Halberstam had reported was accurate. The soldiers who came home and tried to describe what they had experienced encountered a particular kind of social incomprehension. Not the malicious kind, not the spitting and the accusations, which happened but were not universal, but the incomprehension of a society that did not have a framework for receiving what they were saying. The war had not been understood as a war in the sense that World War II had been understood, as a conflict with clear lines and clear enemies, and a clear purpose that could be narrated from beginning to end. Vietnam was a war without legible geography, without front lines, without a fixed enemy, without a moment when you could say that the thing was done. It was a war that asked soldiers to hold and clear and hold again the same ground, to count bodies in terrain that could not be held, to build relationships with a population that had every reason to distrust them, to distinguish between combatants and civilians in a context where the distinction was often impossible. The men who had done these things came home carrying the weight of them, and they found that the society that had sent them had not done the work to understand what it had sent them to do, and in many cases the society did not want to do that work, because doing it would require a kind of honesty about the war that was still too uncomfortable. There were soldiers who refused. There were soldiers who went to Canada. There were soldiers who filed for conscientious objector status after arriving in Vietnam, which was technically possible but practically very difficult, and who served out their tours in units that made their lives miserable because their presence was an inconvenience and their objections were an accusation. There were soldiers who fragged. There were soldiers who sat down in the field and refused to move, which happened with enough regularity by 1970 and 1971 that it was being tracked as a category of incident in Army reports. These acts of resistance were not, in most cases, the product of political sophistication or ideological commitment. They were the product of men who had been in the field long enough to understand that what they were being asked to do was not producing the results they had been promised it would produce, and that the people giving the orders either knew this or were refusing to know it, and that the men in the field were being asked to continue dying for something that had already stopped making sense. The air war generated its own category of falsified record. Pilot reports of targets hit were often impossible to verify because the targets were in triple canopy jungle or in terrain where bomb damage assessment was physically dangerous. The system of measuring air war effectiveness developed its own internal logic that was as divorced from operational reality as the body count system on the ground. Sorties flown became a metric. Ordnance expended became a metric. These were things that could be counted and reported and graphed, and they were reported and graphed, and they were presented as evidence of progress in a campaign whose actual effects on enemy capability were much more difficult to assess. The total tonnage of bombs dropped on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia during the war exceeded the total tonnage of all bombs dropped by all sides in World War II. The enemy continued to fight. The village burning that happened in Vietnam was not always documented as village burning. After-action reports described the destruction of enemy infrastructure, the neutralization of base areas, the elimination of enemy caches, the burning of villages, the destruction of crops, the defoliation of land that families had farmed. These things appeared in official documents in a language designed to make them legible as military operations with military purposes. Agent Orange was described as a herbicide program with the operational purpose of denying the enemy cover and food supply. That description was accurate as far as it went. It did not go as far as the actual effects of the chemical on the people and the land, effects that were not fully understood at the time of application and were systematically minimized in official communications for decades afterward. Veterans who had been exposed to Agent Orange filed claims with the Veterans Administration for conditions they attributed to that exposure. The Veterans Administration denied most of those claims for years on the grounds that a causal link had not been established to the VA's satisfaction. The link was eventually acknowledged, partially and after lengthy legal proceedings, and some benefits were extended, and the acknowledgement came late for many of the men who had been waiting for it. The CORDS program, Civil Operations and Revolutionary Development Support, was the major pacification effort of the late 1960s. It tried to integrate military and civilian programs in a way that earlier approaches had failed to do. It hired people who understood Vietnam, who spoke Vietnamese, who grasped the complexity of what was actually happening in the provinces in a way that the large military bureaucracy in Saigon often did not. Robert Comer and William Colby ran it at different stages with genuine competence and genuine commitment. And yet the program operated within the same reporting environment as everything else, the environment in which numbers needed to flow upward and the numbers needed to show progress. And so CORDS developed its own metrics, the Hamlet evaluation system, which rated hamlets on a scale from A to E based on a series of indicators assessed by district advisors, and the Hamlet evaluation system showed, over time, a steady improvement in the security and development status of South Vietnamese hamlets, and the steady improvement continued even as the military situation deteriorated and even as the assessors in the field knew and said to each other that the ratings were optimistic in ways that served the bureaucratic need for positive trend lines rather than the operational need for accurate information. There was a soldier, one of many, who served 2 tours in Vietnam in the late 1960s. He worked as an intelligence analyst in the second tour, collating reports from the field and passing them up the chain. He has described in subsequent interviews the process by which he learned that the reports he was receiving were unreliable, that the body counts were inflated, that the pacification assessments were systematically optimistic, and that the reports he was producing for his superiors were therefore unreliable in proportion to the unreliability of his sources. He described bringing this to the attention of a superior officer, who listened to him and then explained, in terms that were not unkind but were completely unambiguous, that the role of an intelligence analyst was to produce assessments, not to question the data infrastructure that the assessments rested on, and that questioning the data infrastructure was a career-ending activity that served no one, and that the analyst might want to think about what he wanted his career to look like when the war was over. The analyst produced the optimistic reports. The optimistic reports flowed upward. The war continued. The South Vietnamese military, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, which American policy required to be presented as a capable and improving force moving toward the ability to assume full responsibility for the country's defense, was not consistently that force. This is not a statement about the courage or the commitment of individual South Vietnamese soldiers, many of whom fought and died in circumstances as difficult as anything American soldiers faced. It is a statement about the institution. The ARVN was plagued by corruption at the officer corps level in ways that were well documented in American reports and were well understood by American advisors in the field and were not well reflected in official assessments of Vietnamese capability. Officers purchased their commands and expected a return on that investment. Troop strength reports were inflated because commanders were paid based on troop strength and had every incentive to report phantom soldiers, ghost soldiers, men on the payroll who had died or deserted or never existed. American advisors estimated that genuine ARVN strength was significantly lower than official strength figures suggested. The Vietnamization program, which was the Nixon administration's plan to transfer the war to South Vietnamese forces, was assessed on the basis of figures that reflected reported capability rather than actual capability. The results of this assessment became apparent in 1975. The men who did not come back from Vietnam occupy a different kind of absence in this story. There are 58,281 names on the wall in Washington. The wall was designed by Maya Lin, and it was controversial before it was built, and it became, once built, the most visited memorial in the capital, which suggests that it gave people something they needed in a form they could receive. The wall does not explain the names. It does not provide the context in which each of those men and women died, does not indicate which deaths resulted from enemy action and which from friendly fire, does not note which deaths were reported accurately and which were attributed to causes that served administrative convenience. It simply holds the names. The names are the irreducible reality of the war, the one fact that could not be falsified, the one number that was checked and rechecked and certified because the families were watching. Everything else in the war was subject to the pressures of the reporting environment. The dead were counted accurately. The village of Ben Tre in the Mekong Delta was significantly destroyed during the Tet Offensive. An American officer speaking to an Associated Press correspondent named Peter Arnett explained the destruction with a phrase that became one of the most quoted statements of the war. He said it was necessary to destroy the village in order to save it. The officer has never been conclusively identified. The quote has been disputed, with some arguing that it was inaccurate or taken out of context, and others arguing that it captured something genuinely real about the logic of the war, the way in which the means of protecting a population had become indistinguishable from the means of destroying it. Arnett stood by his reporting. Ben Tre was approximately 50% destroyed. The rubble was there. The Tiger Force was a platoon-sized unit that operated in the Central Highlands in 1967. It was an elite unit, formed from volunteers, with a history of effective operations against enemy forces. What it became by the middle of 1967 was documented in Army investigative records that were classified and not made public until an investigation by the Toledo Blade newspaper in 2003. The investigation found that members of Tiger Force had killed an unknown number of civilians, had taken scalps and ears as trophies, had thrown a baby into a well and dropped a grenade in after it, had committed acts that would constitute war crimes by any applicable legal standard. The Army had investigated Tiger Force in the 1970s and had found the evidence sufficient to support charges against 18 soldiers. None of them were prosecuted. The investigative files were placed in classified storage. The Toledo Blade won a Pulitzer Prize for its 2003 reporting. The Army declined to reopen the investigation. The journalists who had access to the classified record, who were told things by sources inside the government and the military, operated under a constant pressure that was not external censorship, but was something more intimate and more corrosive. It was the pressure of relationship, the fact that their sources would dry up if they published everything they knew, the fact that publishing some things might result in damage to operations or to individuals that they were not prepared to cause. The fact that they themselves had been embedded in the institutions they were covering long enough to have absorbed some of the institutional logic. Daniel Ellsberg had been inside the system. He had worked for the Defense Department and for the Rand Corporation, and he had been in Vietnam, and he had access to the Pentagon Papers, the internal history of the war commissioned by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, and what the Pentagon Papers showed was that the government had systematically lied to the American public about the war from the beginning, had made decisions it had decided in advance not to disclose, had pursued strategies it privately assessed as unlikely to succeed, while publicly asserting confidence. Ellsberg copied the papers and gave them to the New York Times and the Washington Post. The Nixon administration sought an injunction to prevent publication. The Supreme Court ruled against the administration. The papers were published. The war continued for 4 more years. There is a category of death from the Vietnam War that does not appear on the wall, that was not counted in the official casualty figures, that happened after the men came home. Suicide. The Veterans Administration has acknowledged, in reports that have been released over the years with varying degrees of completeness and clarity, that Vietnam veterans have had elevated rates of suicide compared to age-matched non-veterans. The elevation is significant. The mechanism is not simple. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not formally recognized as a diagnosis until 1980, when it was included in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and the recognition came partly as a result of advocacy by Vietnam veterans and the mental health professionals who were treating them. Before the formal diagnosis existed, The men who were experiencing what we now call PTSD were experiencing it without a name for it, without a treatment protocol, without a clear path to assistance from the institutions that had sent them to war. Many of them self-medicated with alcohol and with drugs. Many of them isolated. Many of them died of their wounds years after returning from a war that was officially over. The Laotian operations, the ones that involved American personnel in what was officially a neutral country, generated a body of classified action and classified record that was not fully disclosed until well after the war. The Ho Chi Minh Trail ran through Laos, through the mountains and jungle of the Annamite Range, and interdicting that trail was a constant military objective and a constant failure in the sense that the trail continued to function regardless of the tonnage dropped on it. The CIA ran operations inside Laos with Hmong fighters under General Vang Pao. These operations were effective in their limited tactical sense and catastrophic in their broader human sense, because the Hmong population that was recruited to fight a proxy war on behalf of American objectives was decimated, and when the war ended and the United States withdrew, the Hmong were left to face the consequences of their alliance with a party that had departed, and those consequences were severe and lasted for years. The specific texture of how the war felt to the men who were in it is something that the official record does not capture, and that a certain kind of war journalism also did not capture. Not the firefight, not the dramatic contact, not the heroism or the atrocity, but the ambient quality of a war without front lines in a country where the enemy was everywhere and nowhere. The men who walked the trails in Quang Tri province in 1969 walked with the knowledge that the man ahead of them might step on a mine, that the mine had probably been buried by someone who had been in the rice paddy when they passed through it that morning, that the relationship between the population and the war was not the relationship between civilians and combatants that the rules of engagement presumed. They walked with the knowledge that the rules they had been given were inadequate to the situation they were in, that the adequate response to the situation they were in was something the rules could not sanction, that the choice between doing their jobs and following the rules was a choice that had no clean resolution. Some men resolved it one way and some resolved it another way, and some found that there was no resolution, that the only way through was to stop thinking about it in terms that required resolution, and to simply do what needed to be done in the moment and to account for it later. Or not. The records that were destroyed or lost or never created represent a permanent gap in the historical account. Unit diaries that were not kept. After-action reports that were filed with casualty figures that everyone knew were wrong, but that served the reporting purpose. Intelligence assessments that were adjusted before they went upward to reflect what the command wanted to hear. The gap is not recoverable. The men who know what is in the gap are dying. The ones who have spoken to historians and journalists and family members, and some of what they have said has been recorded, and some of it has been checked against other sources, and some of it has been confirmed, and some of it cannot be confirmed, and perhaps cannot be confirmed either way. The war exists in memory and in the archive, and both are incomplete. And the incompleteness is not accidental. The question of what the war was evolved, or perhaps devolved, over the years of its fighting. The early formulations were about containment, about the domino theory, about preventing the spread of communist control through Southeast Asia. These formulations were not simply propaganda. The people articulating them believed them, or believed them enough to act on them, or needed to believe them, because the alternative was to acknowledge that the costs being incurred did not correspond to any achievable purpose. By the late 1960s, the formulations had shifted. The war was being fought not to win in any defined sense, but to find an exit that would not look like defeat, to achieve a peace with honor that would allow the United States to withdraw, without the loss of credibility that an unambiguous loss would entail. This was a goal in a strict sense. It was something that could in principle be achieved or not achieved, but it was not a war aim in the sense that winning was a war aim. It was a face-saving exercise of enormous cost, conducted at the expense of the men in the field who continued to be killed and wounded and broken in the service of a policy whose objectives they were not told and probably would not have recognized. The negotiations in Paris began in 1968 and continued, intermittently and with long periods of stalemate, until 1973. The Paris Peace Accords were signed in January of 1973. American combat troops withdrew. The POWs came home. The war continued without American ground forces. The North Vietnamese and the National Liberation Front violated the ceasefire provisions of the Accords, as did the South Vietnamese government. American bombing continued in Cambodia until Congress cut off the funds in August of 1973. The South Vietnamese government, without the American military presence and without the level of American support it had been promised, faced a military situation that deteriorated over the following 2 years. In the spring of 1975, the North Vietnamese launched a final offensive. The South Vietnamese military collapsed faster than American analysts had predicted. The last Americans were evacuated from the roof of the embassy in Saigon on April 29, 1975, in a scene that was photographed and filmed, and that became the defining image of how the war ended for the United States. The South Vietnamese who had fought alongside American forces were, for the most part, not evacuated. Some made it out on their own. Many were imprisoned in what the new government called re-education camps. The camps existed for years. Some prisoners were held for more than a decade. The men who served in Vietnam and who came home and who tried to find a way to live with what they had done and what had been done to them and what had failed to be done constitute a population whose full experience has never been adequately reckoned with. Not by the government that sent them, not by the medical and psychiatric institutions that were supposed to treat them, not by the society that absorbed them back into ordinary life and preferred not to ask too many questions. The Agent Orange claims. The PTSD that was not called PTSD. The lives that did not work after the war and whose failure could not be attributed to any recognized category of war injury. The men who are still alive are old now. The men who are not alive were not all killed by the war in any direct sense. But the war was present in the accumulation of their lives in ways that are hard to measure and impossible to dispute. The last American combat deaths in Vietnam are recorded in the official casualty database. The last names on the wall belong to men who died in 1975, some during the final evacuation, some in the Mayaguez incident, a separate operation after the fall of Saigon. The war had a last day in the official record. It had a last casualty in the official count. What it did not have was a clear end in the experience of the people who had been in it, the American soldiers and the Vietnamese soldiers on both sides, and the Vietnamese civilians who had lived through 25 years of continuous war by the time the North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon. The North Vietnamese had been fighting, in one form or another, against foreign occupation since the 1940s, against the Japanese, against the returning French, against the Americans, against the South Vietnamese government. The war that ended in 1975 for the United States had been going on for a generation for the people whose country it was fought in. The veterans of Vietnam who became activists, who organized against the war, who threw medals over fences and testified before Congress and marched on Washington, were a minority of the men who served. The majority came home and said very little about it. They put the experience in a compartment, and they went back to work, and they raised families, and they managed the compartment with varying degrees of success for the rest of their lives. The ones who could not manage it are in the statistics on homelessness among veterans, in the statistics on incarceration, in the statistics on substance abuse, in the suicide statistics that the Veterans Administration has been releasing in increments for decades. The compartment was not a solution. It was a coping mechanism that worked until it did not work, and when it stopped working, there was often nothing in place to take its account. The draft lottery of 1969, which replaced the earlier system of deferments and produced a more random distribution of military obligation across the male population of draft age, changed who was going to Vietnam. The deferment system had produced a military force that was disproportionately drawn from populations without access to the deferments that college enrollment and occupational status provided. The lottery did not fully correct this imbalance, but it introduced an element of randomness that affected the middle class in ways the earlier system had not. Men who had assumed that their college enrollment or their graduate school deferment or their occupational status would protect them from the draft found themselves with low lottery numbers and without that protection. The political consequences of this broadening of the draft's reach included increased middle-class opposition to the war in a form that was more difficult for the government to dismiss than the opposition that had come primarily from students and activists and communities that had been bearing a disproportionate share of the cost all along. The stories that did not reach the news are not all stories of atrocity. Some of them are stories of competence and courage that did not fit the available narratives in either direction, neither the official narrative of progress nor the anti-war narrative of universal criminality. There were advisors who understood Vietnam and worked effectively with Vietnamese counterparts and did things that mattered in a limited way. There were small unit actions conducted with skill and restraint that accomplished what they set out to accomplish. There were intelligence operations that worked. There were medical personnel who saved lives in conditions that required extraordinary improvisation. None of this changes the structural failure of the war, but it is part of the record, and leaving it out would be its own kind of falsification, its own way of making the war into a simple story when the war was not simple. The photographs that came out of Vietnam are a partial record of a reality that was too large and too dispersed to be photographed in any complete way. Nick Ute's photograph of the girl running from the napalm. Eddie Adams's photograph of General Nguyen Ngoc Loan executing a Viet Cong prisoner on the street in Saigon during Tet. These images became icons and they became arguments about the nature of the war that could be made in visual terms that cut through the verbal complexity of official briefings and congressional testimony. But the images that were not taken, that were taken but not published, that were published in contexts too small to reach the national audience, those images are the larger body of evidence, and they are largely inaccessible. When the last C-141 departed Saigon on April 29, 1975, it carried the last Americans and the last Vietnamese who had managed to get out. The ones who did not make it to the helicopters or the boats, the ones who were left behind, the Vietnamese who had worked for the embassy or for the CIA or for the American military and who had been promised that they would be taken care of. Those people faced what they faced in the months and years that followed. The American government acknowledged a moral obligation to these people in general terms, and fulfilled that obligation partially and inconsistently over the following years through refugee resettlement programs that were inadequate to the scale of the crisis they were addressing. The war that the United States fought in Vietnam ended in 1975. The last American combat troops had left in 1973. The POWs had come home. The government of South Vietnam had fallen. The reunification of Vietnam under the Socialist Republic of Vietnam was completed in 1976. American economic sanctions remained in place until 1994. Diplomatic relations between the United States and Vietnam were not fully normalized until 1995, 20 years after the fall of Saigon. By then, the soldiers who had fought the war were in their 40s and 50s. Some of them had gone back. Some of them had found something in the return that the departure had not given them. Some had not gone back. The Vietnamese who had fought on the American backside and survived had lived for 20 years under a government that remembered what side they had been on. The names of the operations, the jargon of the war, the acronyms that accumulated in the cables and the briefing papers and the after-action reports constitute a kind of language that was designed to make the war legible to the people who were managing it from a distance. MACV, CORDS, AO, LZ, KEA, WIA, MIA, body count, pacification, Vietnamization. Each of these terms contained within it a set of assumptions about what the war was and what it was trying to accomplish. And each of those assumptions was contested, and the contest was largely invisible in the official record because the official record was itself a product of those assumptions. The men who knew the gap between the language and the reality were inside the machine that was generating the language, and they generated more language, and the machine continued. The United States spent approximately $160 billion on the Vietnam War in direct costs, with estimates of the total cost, including long-term obligations to veterans, running considerably higher. The number of American military personnel who served in Vietnam over the course of the war is approximately 2.5 million. The number of Americans killed is 58,281. The number of Americans wounded is approximately 300,000. The number of Vietnamese killed, civilian and military on all sides, is estimated by demographers at between 1.5 and 3.5 million, with the range reflecting the genuine uncertainty of the historical record. The number of Cambodians and Laotians who died as a result of the war's extension into those countries is an additional unknown quantity. These are the numbers that are available. They are not the whole story, and they were not available when the decisions that produced them were being made. The war did not end when the shooting stopped. It continued in the bodies of the men who had been in it. It continued in the land that had been soaked with chemicals and cratered with bombs and stripped of vegetation. It continued in the communities that had been disrupted and the families that had been broken and the political structures that had been distorted by decades of foreign intervention. It continued in the memory of the people who had lived through it and the silence of the people who had chosen not to speak about it and the false certainty of the official accounts that had replaced the messy and uncomfortable truth with a story that could be managed. The last American soldier to die in Vietnam, in the official casualty count, died while the war was in one sense already over. The machinery that had produced the war, the bureaucratic momentum, the institutional need to continue what had been started, the political cost of acknowledging that the continuation served no purpose, that machinery had kept the war going years after the people running it had concluded that it could not be won in any meaningful sense. The soldiers who died in those last years died in a war that its architects no longer believed in, that the public had largely turned against, that the Vietnamese on whose behalf it was ostensibly being fought had complicated and contradictory feelings about. The war continued because stopping it required someone to say that it was over, and saying it was over meant saying that everything that had been spent to keep it going had been spent for nothing, and that was a thing that no one in a position to stop it was willing to say out loud. In the fall of 1969, 2 years before American troop levels would begin their significant decline, and 6 years before the fall of Saigon, a soldier in Quang Tri province wrote a letter home. The letter described the terrain and the heat and the boredom and the fear. It described a patrol that had found nothing, that had moved through a village that was empty, that had come back to base without contact. It described the feeling of not knowing what the mission was, not in the sense of not having been briefed, but in the sense of not being able to construct a purpose that connected the specific activities of the day to any outcome that mattered. The letter was not published. It was kept by the family. It is an ordinary document. It describes an ordinary day in a war that was producing thousands of ordinary days, each of which contained within it the full weight of a conflict that had long since ceased to know what it was trying to accomplish and continued anyway, because continuing was the path of least institutional resistance, and the war had become its own justification, and the men inside it were the last to have any power over whether it stopped.